today we said we wanted to build on the last episode where we talked about my time at Netflix. Mac and I had a good, well, I thought it was a good conversation anyway. We'll leave that to the judgment of our audience. But we went deep into different aspects of Netflix culture. We removed the veil a little bit, and hopefully that was useful for people who have kind of been on the sidelines wondering what it was like. I mean, there's also tons of content out there of leaders and people who have been at Netflix far longer than I, who've got lots of good content out there. But thanks, Mac, for last episode. I felt glad to be able to get some things off my chest.
This is a therapy session. This is what it's
Yeah,
turned
this
into.
is therapy out here. But we do want to talk about feedback.
Yeah.
What's a good place to start? I think maybe laying out what is it we mean by feedback, and why are we talking about feedback?
It's a phrase used in so many companies, often in the context of culture. So I think it's a really good one to talk about. Definitely. I know you've written some stuff on feedback, Kenny, which I've read and it's interesting.
I have, and we can, we'll share it in the show notes as well for people in case they want to check it out. I wrote a letter to my daughters, well, a kind of a fictional, non-fictional letter where I said, imagine they were 21, 22, going into the corporate world. How could I furnish them with some ideas and thoughts around how to survive? And I think feedback, it's just one of those things which I didn't feel adequately prepared for before I started work as well. But also, one thing to call out is in our day-to-day lives of our partners and friends, we don't say, hey, can I give you some feedback? It's not.
But we are giving feedback.
But we are giving
we
feedback.
Give feedback to spouses, children, the shopkeeper.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's why I want to start by just laying out what we mean, because to your point, there's the ongoing conversation. So if you think about the work context, there's the ongoing conversation about how someone's doing, what someone's working on, what's working well, what's not. It could be an engineer who's reviewing code. No engineer waits to the end of the year to review code. It could be someone who, spelt something wrong, or we've delivered a report. Okay, so there's like the ongoing work. Take the entertainment world, again, think about Netflix from our last episode. A lot of directors and creative talent will talk about giving and receiving notes. So you take a script, you review the script, and then you might say, I've got no notes. You might say, I've got, some minimal notes. So like there are professions and contexts where the idea of just sharing honest perspective on the work is just part and parcel. But the same thing, to your point, is true in day-to-day life, right? Bianca gives me tons of feedback every day. I give her a bit of feedback, and we're constantly giving feedback. I'm constantly giving feedback to my children. We don't call it that, but we're constantly trying to improve each other. We're constantly trying to have honest conversations about how we're experiencing each other. And I think that there's both an art and science to having honest conversations. And that's the kind of thing we want to talk about.
Let me jump off there. Okay. So in the context of your wife and kids, well, in a healthy family dynamic, the assumption is if anyone's given feedback, it is for kind of growth, development, and for the greater good of the person you're giving it to, because you love them. They're not paying you to be there.
Yeah.
You've chosen to be, but you've chosen to be.
Not.
Yeah. So
I'll pay you to be my wife.
Some relationships are like that, but generally speaking, healthy relationships, you love them, they love you, you've chosen them or given birth to them, i.e. children, not partners or spouses. So whenever someone gives feedback, it comes from that place. Now, sometimes you do feel like, a family member or someone close to you gives you feedback and you think, was that in my best interest, or, what's going on there? It wasn't the best experience. But generally, the feedback is happening within that kind of landscape of love, care, affection. So I think often your guard won't necessarily be up in the same way. Well,
maybe
sorry,
you.
I'm just talking about my perfect family here.
Mac, speak for yourself, Mac.
I suppose what I'm saying is, that's not all families. What I'm basically saying is that sometimes.
Should we get Jules on the podcast?
Yeah, exactly. If feedback happens in the context of there's a general sense of love, understanding, it's about mutual growth, mutual respect. Feedback that happens in that type of context with each other is great. But as soon as you remove that, or that's not the landscape within which feedback is happening, it can turn dark very quickly, both in a familial context or in a more corporate organizational context. I just wanted to kind of start there because there's something for me about the context within which the feedback or the conversation is occurring.
I think that's spot on. Before we started the conversation, I was thinking about the organizational context and the fact that in and of itself, the having of an honest conversation about where I stand or where you stand or the thing that we're doing together, be that work or something else, like as you say, that's a valuable thing regardless. But as soon as you do that in an organizational setting where there isn't the same level of trust, there isn't the same level of intimacy, there's a heck of a lot of politics in most companies. And then you've got all the other things like performance reviews or, the fact that the person who you're having a honest conversation with kind of controls your destiny to an extent. If they're your manager, they can have a big impact on kind of what happens to you. So all of those things end up warping something that inherently is a good thing. To your point, if you care about someone, you want their best. You want to be able to point out things that are coming around the corner or things that they may not see that if they keep doing won't be positive for them. And I think the context piece you mentioned is important. I think the other piece for us to lay out at the start is the psychological piece and the fact that as human beings, we have a natural adverse reaction to negative perception. So if someone doesn't think I've done something well, like that's something that sort of sticks with us. I heard someone say, I'll give her a shout out, Lucy Adams. I heard her say that, and I think she was quoting from a psychologist, that saying to somebody, I've got some feedback for you, is a bit like walking up to somebody in a dark alley behind them and tapping them on the shoulder. It just kind of hijacks, the amygdala, right? The sort of that fight or flight reaction part of the brain.
Yeah, yeah. I remember once I was in a workplace and I'd done some work with someone more senior than me on a job, and I basically went up to them and I said to them, "Oh, I just wanted to give you some feedback. Can we just find somewhere quiet?" Anyway, the feedback was all positive. I basically just wanted to say to them really intentionally and clearly, the way you led the team, led us was incredible. And then listed out the reasons why. The person was totally shocked because it felt like I had, yeah, figuratively speaking, tapped them on the shoulder in the dark alley. They were expecting something negative and their threat response was ready. And then they were totally
Mm,
like dumbfounded when I actually just wanted to really clearly and intentionally tell them that they were great and that I'd benefited just from something they'd done.
yeah. What's the best piece of feedback you've ever been given? Or let me put it this way, what's the most memorable feedback conversation you've had? And that could have been a constructive, a positive, difficult, whatever. What's the most memorable conversation you've had? I've got a couple that if you want to think, but
Okay, so I was playing a role on it was a transformation role in the company. So I sat on the board of this company and I kind of liked the role because I could play broadly. Basically, I can do lots of things and do lots of things well, so I could just play where I wanted. Okay.
Mhm, mhm.
And I remember having a conversation with the CEO, and he just said to me, "Look, Matino, you're really good at doing stuff, and you can play in many different lanes. But sometimes you need to just be aware of the fact that if you play in certain lanes, you could step on someone's toes because it's their job to do that thing. So just because you can fix something and you can do something doesn't mean that you should." And what I loved about that feedback is it kind of highlighted and affirmed my strengths, but it talked about the overuse of my strengths. And also, it just felt like an observation. The way it was
Yeah.
delivered was it was elegantly delivered. It wasn't
Mm,
damning of my character. It wasn't like you're stepping on people's toes. It was more just a bit of feedback and a reflection. It was a mirror within which I could just see myself, and it provided a perspective or an angle on the way I was turning up.
mm,
And it didn't feel final. It felt like something that I could weigh, that I could receive or I could reject. Ultimately, I received it because it resonated. And the style within which it was delivered meant that my guard was down. But that
mm.
was a really nice, clear example of feedback. And I knew it to be true because if you ask my wife or anybody that knows me, that's who I am.
A few things to pull out on what you said. One, you talked about the elegance of it, the thoughtfulness around it.
Mm,
You felt like there was a level of trust that they had your back. It also resonated with you, so it was harder for you to disagree with. And I've always thought that a really good, honest conversation is the kind that leaves you feeling good afterwards, even though your ego may be a little bit bruised, even though it might have started as a difficult conversation. You end up thinking, or at least I think you ought to end up feeling like, wow, I'm so glad we had that conversation. Like I can think of examples where you've Do you remember the conversation you had with someone and they said, I think you would ask them where they would position you in a company or something, and they said something like, If I was your manager, I would tell any future Max manager to just give him the freedom to find a problem and just go after it." Do you remember that?
So actually, in the context of this was somebody had to give a reference to a company, and they just said, "Yeah, I will fly if you just give him problems, he'll solve them, but just give him freedom, and any problem that you kind of want solved, he'll be able to do it."
And that, so yeah, exactly. Thanks for the clarification. So that, for me though, is an example of, it's not kind of formal, let's sit down and have a feedback conversation like it has to be this big event, but it's insight and it's perception that is valuable. And I think that's the other thing, that whatever you want to call it, wherever, I think Microsoft internally, they call it perspectives rather than feedback.
That's quite a nice way of describing it, because you're providing a perspective from your vantage point. Because the reality is, the way you turn up, the totality of yourself will be found in lots of different perspectives.
Mm,
So you'll experience one side of me, my wife will experience another, my friend will experience another, my colleague might experience another. And in totality, there's a true picture of the multifaceted me. But the perspective is just a vantage point, because also you're often sharing it from your particular position, your particular context. So it
mm,
is an angle, it is a view, but it's often not the full view. It can sometimes be a warped view. You could be standing behind a pillar and not know it as you're giving the perspective. You may be impacted by your own bias in that perspective. But I like the sense of a perspective is like, here's something for you to think about, something for you to reflect on. It's not final. It's not like a line in the sand about who you are, but it's just a sense of it. But so much of feedback is not that. So much of feedback is, I mean, the worst places I've seen feedback is where it's given in a really sort of final, a sort of fatalistic way. Like
yeah.
this is who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd written something similar the other day. Like, and I'll just read it. If you think about feedback, you always have some kind of perception that X is happening, or you're noticing that X is happening, but you don't have any clue as to why. And you may be perceiving something in a faint way, in a low res. You don't have all of the context, right? So for me, the first thing to do then is to stop and check in. Like, the person who wants to give the feedback should be asking them, well, what am I noticing? And why do I want to even share this in the first place? Like, that for me is the first thing. And for me, what that leads to is, we ought to have far more humility when we're wanting to give quote unquote feedback than most people do. To your point, like, we go into it with too much finality rather than curiosity. So it's like, we should be ready to be absolutely wrong. I think we ought to be going into conversation to say things like, hey, do you know what, Kenny? I noticed this the other day. Like, I'm wondering, did I see that correctly? But just the spirit of humility to say, I may not have all of the details. One example that I'll give, I've given this in previous podcasts, I think before. This was at PA Consulting, right? And Nick, who both Mac and I were part of Nick's
Shout out
team.
Nick Shackleton Jones.
Shout out to 5DI Shackleton Jones. It's an inside joke.
5DI for life.
He shared some feedback with me that has always stayed with me, like, from a business perspective. We were on a client call and I could feel like my words were sort of falling to the ground. You know, when you're talking, but you can tell it's not having the impact. And like, those kind of dust balls in those cowboy movies, I could just sort of see the dust balls blowing in front of me. And I was like, something's not working here. Why is it that I'm talking, but it feels like my words are just falling and not really landing? So he comes in from another room, knocks on a door, because we were both on this client call in separate rooms. And he says, typical Nick style, is like, how do you think that went? And, very curious. And he said, can I give you my perspective? I said, yeah, absolutely. And he just said this line. He said, Kenny, you have a tendency of caveating when you're saying things, which lowers your impact. It's a bit like you're dipping your headlights. And what he meant was, I would say something and then say, maybe, if, probably, who knows? And it just muddies the whole thing. And, truth be told, like, it's much deeper than that. And I've been in some therapy to think about, like, where it all comes from. But that stayed with me. One, because it felt accurate. Guess what? Two, it was actually helpful. Do you know what I mean? I went away, and still to this day, 10 years later, I can be talking about it on a podcast.
On that, Kenny, because something strikes me about that example. Sometimes feedback touches a nerve or something deeper. So superficially, someone might say, don't dip your headlights, but actually when you describe therapy, it sounds like you had to go and process something because that dipping of headlights was connected to something bigger. And sometimes I find that's a challenge with feedback is you can unknowingly hit something or trigger something deeper in a person.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, 100%. And look, I'll be honest, I think part of it for me, it all comes down to our childhood, as you know, but I learned to repress anger and repress rage
Mm.
for different reasons. And what I was working through with my therapist was why that was the case, where that comes from. I ended up maybe overcompensating by being overly respectful, overly polite, or wanting to manage other people's feelings so that I wouldn't just land something in a abrasive, harsh way. Probably because at some point when I was younger, I did that, and the reaction was the reaction. So we were working on with my therapist. We were working on basically not worrying about my own how I might come across and how I might land.
I think that's powerful though, because you had the kind of awareness, well, and the opportunity to go and explore that further.
Yeah.
But I think that's sometimes when feedback goes wrong is when unintentionally it touches a nerve, but the person maybe doesn't have sometimes it's courage, sometimes it's opportunity, but they don't really want to go there because by embracing or accepting that feedback, it says something else true about themselves that they don't want to to realize or face into.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I mean,
Like, I'll give you an example. Like the example that was given of me, which is, oh, you're good at loads of things, but don't step on people's toes. I think I talked about this in a previous conversation we had. I've always had a thing about being mixed race and growing up in environments where I was kind of constantly told I needed to be in a box, but the reality was that I wasn't in a box. I
mm,
was I was born outside boxes. I'm not sort of black. I'm not white. I'm mixed race. Even as you grow up, you're kind of exposed to and you kind of learn to think differently and think in different ways and playing different roles. So even when that feedback was given to me about, well, you're really good at playing lots of roles and doing lots of things, but don't step on toes. My trigger there is don't try and say I have to be in a box. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
I've spent my lifetime sort of exploring and embracing the fact that I can play in different areas. Like that's my kind of deeper trigger on that. Now, again, I was conscious and aware of that. So when it was told to me, I could take it as it is. But often I think feedback can speak to something deeper. And that's what I think can set hairs racing and set the amygdala into overdrive is that when there's something unprocessed, there's something traumatic, there's something from the past which the feedback speaks to and points to, which the person isn't ready to explore.
yeah. Not ready to explore, and also just doesn't even see it. Like you could,
Yeah, yeah, it's just beyond awareness.
yeah, right. And so the whole, kind of having a blind spot and having a section of
Oh,
yourself that
Johari's window.
the Johari's window, yeah,
Describe
which is
Johari's window, Kenny.
well, it was like these two psychologists who happened to be named, I
Sorry,
think,
sorry, not to put you on the spot, by the way. I'm like,
No, no, it's fine, it's
describe
fine.
Johari's
Yeah,
window.
exactly. 3, 2, 1, go. But it's basically there's two psychologists. I think their names were Joe and Harry, and so it was shortened
Is
into
that true?
Joe Harry. Yeah, yeah, that's quite right. I don't know their surnames. That's as far as I remember. But yeah, it's this 2 by 2 matrix. Every single problem in life can be solved by a 2 by 2 matrix. Every consultant knows that. And so the one axis is information that is known to you. And another axis, I think, is like information that is kind of known to the world or seen to
Others,
the
yeah.
world or whatever. And so when you plot each of the squares, there is essentially a section which is both unavailable to you, so you don't know it, but others can see it. And then there's the unconscious, right, which is kind of your realm, which is areas that are both unavailable and inaccessible to both the person and others,
Yes.
and it's
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
deep
Yeah.
embedded.
Yeah.
So the blind spot is like stuff that people can see. And to the point we were just making, it's like if someone says something and says, "Oh, Kenny, you know, this has happened," or "You're doing this," first of all, yeah, there's the defensiveness where we naturally want to defend ourselves. And it's a hard thing. It's a really hard thing to like bypass that defensiveness. And then two, we may not even know it's a thing. And so it just doesn't even resonate. So it's kind of hard to receive. I was also thinking about, well, just pausing on that bit for a minute to come back to that later. I was thinking about what you just shared around, the trigger points and yes, the defensiveness around that. But also people can give you feedback that is absolutely opposite to what other people have said in the past. Right. So I give an example. I was working with someone and I said to her, she was sharing quite a lot in the meeting. And very simply, I noticed that there were about 20 people on the call, 30 people on the call. And in my head, I was thinking, okay, if I don't get ahead of this, people are going to think I've just let the meeting, roll on and I've let somebody monopolize the conversation. So I said, hey, let's call her Sandra. I don't think I
Mm.
know any Sandras, so I think we're safe. So I said, Sandra, actually, could we pause? I'd love to hear from other people. Mac, I heard later after that people saying that they felt I was maybe a little bit rude or I cut across her. Was she okay? She left the call because she had something to do. And so people put two and two together and thought maybe she left the call because I'd asked her not to share anymore. So I messaged her separately and said, hey, look, could we get on a call? I'd just love to talk about that, make sure you're okay or whatever. And she said to me, she said, Kenny, it's funny, you were giving me feedback about sharing. I was oversharing because people said to me in the past that I didn't speak enough in meetings. So like she's there trying to respond to feedback. I'm there now trying to give her feedback, and she's probably thinking, "What? I can't win," you know. So like the other piece, and this is why I think the humility is so important, because we have this quote unquote feedback that we want to share that we think is really important, and it might be, it may not be, but there's so much value in asking the questions first to understand where is that other person coming from, what are they trying to do or achieve in what they're doing, rather than rushing in as if your feedback is the gospel truth.
I think what you're saying is really interesting because it's important to weigh feedback. I mean, I have been given feedback and I've just said, no, that's not true. Sometimes you start
Yeah, we should double click on that. That's really interesting. Yeah.
basically over time in life, you start to see patterns in feedback. So there's a point where I know what you're going to say because my personality hasn't changed. I am kind of who I am. I'm at a point now where it's like I know my strengths, I know my weaknesses, I know how I turn up, and I can kind of relatively accurately predict what's going to come up. So sometimes now it just means if someone says something to me, sometimes I can just tell that this isn't about me, this is about you. Maybe
Mm,
this is a power play, maybe this is the context. So if it's coming from you and it's almost a projection, I'll have no problem saying I disagree with it because I don't think it's my stuff, it's your stuff. And actually, me receiving it and trying to integrate that into myself is damaging.
yeah. Well, and
So,
most people just jumping in there. I mean, in an organizational setting, that already that can be dangerous because impression management is a thing, and how
yeah.
whether we like it or not, how people perceive you. So typically, what can happen is the person that does that very quickly becomes labeled or tagged, the person who you can't give feedback to, or the defensive one, or whatever. The kind of behavior that spawns then is people who do genuinely think that end up just saying, oh, okay, thank you for the feedback. So they kind
But
of
then it's
feign.
worrying because, then it's worrying because it kind of almost affirms that as a data point. It's like a large language model
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
read
And
something
so
wrong
so
and integrated it into a state. So for me, it's like I've got a ton of data that I've captured about who I am. Ton of data. So if you bring me something that's totally left field that doesn't feel true to the situation, true to me, then I weigh it and I'll say kind of the system says no because it doesn't
there's
like
the system
because it
says,
because you're not giving me feedback into like it's not this is not neutral territory. This is I have a and again this is not me saying I don't take feedback. It's saying I've had a lot of feedback given to me about lots of different things.
yeah, yeah,
I've not had a personality transplant. Therefore, if you say something to me that's really left field, the only place I end up is probably thinking it says something about you or it says something about what you're trying to do in this moment through the feedback.
yeah,
Because the challenge is the person, firstly, is the person aware enough that they are just giving you feedback that is about you and not about them? Because again,
mm,
projection is a big sort of defense that can play out. But also, is it something to do with the position that you're in or the context within which you're giving it? And that can color and skew feedback. So, I've had managers who feel like they need to give feedback because they're a manager.
I know exactly what you mean on that one. Let's say that. I remember working at a company and I had a very senior exec put some time in my diary, and this person had never put time in my diary before. And I genuinely, I kid you not, I thought this was great. This person wanted to say how much they valued the work I was doing. They valued my contribution because I was confident about what I delivered. We got on the call and she said, hey, I just wanted to let you know, I heard some feedback that you're not the easiest person to work with. And I sort of, first of all, I was like, okay, that wasn't what I was expecting.
Just to say, even me hearing that, I'm kind of like,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
you've known me
it
for
just
more than
doesn't
20
ring.
years. Yeah,
It
yeah.
doesn't
I mean,
ring. Anyway, carry on.
well, especially think about the feedback that
The
someone else,
dipping of the
the
headlights
dipping of the
example.
headlights, exactly. It
Yeah.
doesn't, all of that. So there's two things. There was my reactions in a moment, and then what this speaks to as far as like the broader piece around feedback. My reactions in a moment was to say, well, where are you getting this from? Okay, tell me more. I wanted to be curious, and look, this is a very senior person in the business. So what I didn't want to do is to show any sign of, look, I can't receive the feedback. So I was just like, okay, so tell me more. I'm curious, which I think is one thing to do when you get feedback you disagree with. And then this story got worse because then she said, it wasn't from me, it's from somebody else. And I said, can I speak to that person? Guess what? No, no, I kid you not. The
Talk to
answer,
your source.
reveal your source. No, the source had left the building. He was no longer in the company. I kid you not.
Wait,
He
so
had
she's
left the
given you
company.
what feedback in with almost like the
Feedback.
So the feedback was given by this person. They left the company.
And then now
Now
she's passing it along.
passing on to you. Okay.
Yeah. So what do you even do with that? I mean, it's like, for me, if I was in her shoes, I would have said, if this person was giving feedback to me about Kenny, I'd like, well, and what did Kenny say when you shared that directly with him at the time? Rather than your secondhand passing on feedback. Leaders, I think leaders ought to get into a practice of, and not just leaders, and this applicable in the home and with friendships as well. Like, don't be the messenger and don't be the person that's kind of passing along feedback, because in that moment, I didn't even know what the person was referring to. Anyway, long story short, we agreed for me to go and do some fact finding, as it were. So I went around to different members of the team, the wider team, to say, hey, look, I've heard this kind of data point. I'm just curious.
The true.
Well, not is it true, but more so like, what's your experience of me? And what I will say is, I think one powerful thing about feedback is that when done well, it should trigger an honest conversation about stuff that was underneath the surface, but people didn't at the time feel like they had a chance to share. So me going to other team members and saying, hey, look, I've had this data point. I just would love to know what's your experience of me. Hopefully that should then give them a chance to say, okay, do you know, it's funny. Maybe I don't agree with this, but actually, maybe it could be to do with something else. The bigger picture, I think the idea of, as human beings, we don't see the full picture in terms of how we land on other people. We just can't. Is it helpful to get some perspectives? Yes. But as I talk about in the article that I wrote, not all perspectives are made equal, my friend. Like, I'm sorry, I don't need to listen to every single person's perspective, because you may not have the context about what I was doing at the time. You may not be an accurate judge of the situation. Like, without going too much on a tangent, Marcus Buckingham wrote this interesting piece called The Feedback Fallacy. And he basically said, like, human beings are terrible judges of behavior and of situations. And I won't go into all of it because I don't agree with everything he wrote in there. But everybody's got an opinion, basically. And in this era of social media, and we will post our thoughts. I'm constantly posting things, right? We've been in an era of, we've all got something to say. And I think there is value in having humility to listen to others, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. But I'm circling back to your point where it's like, just because you've given some feedback doesn't mean you're right, and doesn't mean you shouldn't be open to a conversation to say, well, actually, maybe I'm wrong.
But yeah, and also to go back to your example, you need multiple data points to establish a trend. Let me talk about this in the context of many companies do 360s on people. That maybe this is a more formal feedback mechanism for those of you listening. If you're not aware of what a 360 is, it's when you might go and get feedback from multiple sources and say, what do you think of Kenny and how he's doing, things he does well, things he could improve in. What I've noticed is that we often don't apply sort of true trend analysis to picking up what are the different trends that come from across different people. So if one person says one thing, okay, cool. Have 5 out of 8 said something. Now, if there are 5 out of 8, then I would say, well, there's probably a trend there. There's something going on. If 2 of 8 have said something, is that a statistically significant percentage that warrants my attention.
Yeah.
But often what I find really interesting is in the context of, again, more formalized feedback or feedback situations in a corporate context, we don't apply true trend analysis. Either there's a heavy weighting given to a senior stakeholder's perception where one person said something, nine say something different, but because that one person, I don't know, was a SVP of something, then suddenly that swings it. Or you're taking two
SVP stands for
isolated,
Senior Vice President, in case someone doesn't know.
or you're taking two pieces of isolated feedback in and amongst 10 other perspectives. And for me, that doesn't constitute a trend. That just constitutes someone shared something. It's fun. I remember I did sociology at uni, and we did a lot of sort of statistical analysis, and we did things like grounded theories. So like grounded theory would be, well, I think grounded theory has almost disappeared now in the context of like AI, but essentially you might take four different texts and then you would kind of create different ways of marking different concepts through those texts. And then you'd say, okay, from a thematic perspective, there are, I don't know, 5 themes, and here's the one dominant theme or thread that we can find through the text. You were trying to take something that was quite intangible, like pieces of text, and you're trying to almost find a hidden code within it and understand what sat underneath it. What I find sometimes in the context of companies is how poor we are at being able to apply sort of statistical methods to analyzing many perspectives. The number of times I've seen, like I said, a senior perspective or one or two perspectives in and amongst the 30 people that someone might work with dominate the
Yeah.
narrative is alarming.
Yeah, it's and what can happen there is it can serve to simply justify or provide fodder for someone's bias, or for someone has already made up their mind and they're simply looking for evidence to confirm a perspective that they have. And so it becomes this game where people say, well, actually I heard feedback about X, and it's like, well, yeah, to your point, that's one maybe it's one data point among sort of hundreds of others, but because
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
maybe serves a certain agenda. Now, I want to make sure for people listening, they don't think we are simply poo-pooing the whole idea, because what we're actually doing is trying to get under the surface of it all, because there is, let's be clear, there's value in, if I'm doing something that is not landing or not impactful, I want to be the first to know. The question is, can any of us handle the truth? It's like that, the Jack Nicholson, I always go back to Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise. Amazing scene. If you've not seen A Few Good Men, man, you're missing out. But Jack Nicholson, who's this army general, there was some malpractice. Tom Cruise is grilling him. And he's like, I want the truth. And Jack Nicholson's like, you want the truth? You can't handle the truth. And I laugh, but I think about that a lot, because there's a question around everybody. Can people really handle honesty? Exactly right. You've got, right? No, just the truth. We've got many of us, both at home, in families, friendships, companies, and we say we want people to be honest. I want to say this: direct, bold, naked honesty is not a grace, and it's not a kindness. There's something about how we deliver and share things. Sometimes we choose to deliver something indirectly, sending a signal, and hopefully somebody, will get the picture. My friend Lorna, I give her a shout out at Netflix. She'd often ask a question, and the question was actually feedback. But if you weren't paying attention, you wouldn't have noticed that she's giving you feedback
Yeah.
by asking a question.
I like what you're saying, because there's something in how you deliver it. So, it's like my postman. If my postman, I don't know, tied the letter to a brick and threw it.
You've got some dodgy, but
If he threw it through my front window and it landed in my front room, I'd be like, I don't care that you've given me feedback. The fact is, you just smashed my window.
yeah, that feedback isn't a gift.
But yeah, that's not, well, I don't know. I don't know. That's a crime. But the thing about elegance, some of the most beautiful feedback is delivered creatively. So the dipping of the headlights, I mean, it's a lovely, lovely picture that was given to you.
Yeah.
I had someone give me a picture recently. Again, it was like the way it was described was, sometimes we can receive pictures.
The one about risk, that was a good one. Do you want to share that one?
Yeah. Well, I was talking to, he's kind of like a psychotherapy mentor, and I'd been in a pub with him 5 years ago, and interestingly, he gave me feedback, and it kind of heard him, but I kind of didn't. He basically said to me, he said, Tuno, I said to him, I'm a risk taker. He said, no, you're a risk chaser. Now, I didn't quite, I thought it was a curious phrase. Anyway, we had a couple of drinks, went on our way. Later, I was kind of round his house. We go around there because they make great banoffee pie. They live out kind of in Essex, like kind of like older,
Yeah,
older mentors. You can kind of go there and kind of relax
love
back
it.
into their sofas and spend time with them.
Yeah, totally.
But he raised this question with me again. As Matuno, you're a risk chaser, and he said, you never asked me what I meant. I said, well, it did stick with me because it's a strange phrase. And he just said to me, look, there is probably something about you in that you're kind of addicted to the chase of things. You like
Mm,
pursuing things. You like the thrill. And he said, that's great because sometimes that means that combined with your competence, you can jump here and jump there and chase this and chase that. But he just said
mm.
there gets a point in your life where you're tired of chasing different things. And he said, you're a little bit like a dog that hears the tires screech and runs after the car and then bites the tire and realizes it's a tire.
Wow.
I know this is
That's an
powerful
image.
feedback. I
That's
don't think I could
powerful.
have
Yeah.
heard that 5 years ago. But what I mean is, but it resonated with me. I thought, you know what, you're kind of right. Like he was just basically saying to me, in terms of your career, in terms of who you are, it's about how you now start to kind of establish and settle within something and truly take a risk. But taking a risk, there's a higher degree of intentionality. You're slightly more settled. You're clearer on your goal. You're clearer on what you're trying to go after. And then you're taking risk towards it. It's not just chasing different things because they seem fun, they seem exciting, and you heard the tire screech. But delivered as a picture, I was able to, in therapeutic terms, we talk about metabolize. So it's like
Mm,
food. If something goes in too big, you can't metabolize it. It just sits in your system and you either just take it straight through and out,
yeah. Yeah.
or you just eject it.
Yeah.
But when you deliver something creatively, or you kind of, and again, it's not polishing it, but when you take time to think about how it's served, the person can internalize it, metabolize it, digest it, and then they can take the nutrients from it.
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
preaching here,
Yeah. Go ahead. Preach it.
and they can absorb it into their system.
Yeah. There's I love that. I love that. I think the picture, the analogy, it's so helpful. And there's another thing you said there as well, which was 5 years ago, you don't know if you could have heard that. So the other piece is the person who's
Timing.
having the conversation, there's timing. Like there's timing and wisdom in knowing, actually, if I share this, can this person receive
They're
it?
not ready. They're
They're
not
not
ready.
ready.
Yeah.
You know, as Prochaska's, is it Prochaska's kind of five, things of change? Is it Prochaska? I can't remember the name.
Oh,
There's like readiness.
there's studies around. It was studies around smoking and kind of
Yes.
how people stop smoking. But you had kind of
Yes.
like denial when you're not aware of the problem.
Yeah.
You had kind of awareness when you're kind of aware of an issue, but you're not quite taking the
Yeah.
choice to change it. Then you have
Yeah.
choosing, then you have action, then you have maintenance where you're maintaining the behavior change long term.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sometimes we're just in denial, and sometimes defensiveness means we just can't face the truth yet. We're not in that position.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned something about having it land. And in the article that I wrote, point number 8, I just want to read out one of the points because this for me is it's just always been something I come back to. So anyway, I'll read it, and it's by a guy called A.C. Grayling, and I think he sums it up well. He says, "Tact is an intelligent virtue. Everyone can be frank, even the simple and careless, but not everyone can finally adjust how and what he says to ameliorate human intercourse, through which more good is likely to come than otherwise." And here's the kicker: telling the whole truth requires more thought and preparation than mere plain speaking does. Telling the whole truth requires more thought and preparation than mere plain speaking does. And I think what he's saying is that like anyone can just blurt out words and say, I'm being brutally honest. Hey, I just want to be brutally honest. I'm going to be radically candid. But it's one thing to just say something honestly, and it's another thing to say it in a way that can land like if you think about your example. Where I disagree with this is, like, to be clear, there are sometimes it depends on who you're talking to. Because the other thing with feedback is we should often ask the question, like, what's your style? How do you like to have these conversations? What works for you? Because for one person, they just want you to be really blunt, and they can handle really blunt and direct. Like that's the kind of language they want. Other people, they need more of that honey before you give them the vinegar. You just got to give them a lot of honey. You got to sweeten them up just because it won't land. And I think for me, that's the point.
But I think that's the whole thing about delivering it creatively. Again, if you're like a chef serving something, you think about like who's receiving this. Like I said, some people just want straight from the pan
Yeah.
raw.
Just give it
That's
to
how
me.
they like it. Some
Yeah.
people, they like a little bit of presentation, but it's that sensitivity. And again, if you care about the person you're delivering the feedback to, then you would tend to be intentional, thoughtful, and creative around how you deliver it.
Yeah.
If you don't
Yeah.
care, then whatever, you'll
Yeah.
deliver it. But I
Yeah.
also
And for
think
you
it's
and I, and for
yeah.
you and from a, from a faith perspective, for me,
Mm,
this is inextricable. I like to pray on some things and say, "Hey, Lord, help me with how to share this with
mm.
somebody in a way that will land, in a way that would be honoring of them, graceful for them." That doesn't mean there are some times where I just need to just say it, and there is no. It's you just got to say the hard thing. But often, I also like to sit with it and pray about it, and so that because I think words matter. And the things you say stay with people. We've just been sharing the things people have shared with us that have stayed with us till this day. And so if I say something that's careless, willy-nilly, and that person then is thinking about that, they're up all night, and it's been something that is totally off
Yeah.
because I've been careless about it, that doesn't do anyone any good.
And look, there's something else that I think is worth talking about here, which is again, sometimes in our conversation, there's the assumption that feedback is the constructive feedback. I still think we have a challenge around just being able to give and sit with positive feedback.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll give you an interesting example here. When I was, again, a lot of these stories seem to go back to consulting. I don't know why, but anyway, it's where we it's where we work together.
Yeah. And it's also a crucible, isn't it? I think in consulting,
Yeah, it's a crucible.
you
Yeah, yeah.
pick up so much.
Because you're delivering so many projects all the time, you're constantly getting feedback from clients, feedback from people around you. It does
Exactly.
sharpen you.
It
It's a good
does.
training ground.
Yeah.
But I remember it was a piece of work, delivered it with so it was me and it was a partner in the firm. And just for context, a partner is like someone senior who looks after the client and manages the client relationship. Anyway, we delivered a piece of work in like record breaking time. It was a really sophisticated bit of sort of cultural assessment work where we went into like 5, 6 different companies and got under the skin in really creative ways to try and figure out if what was going on in the companies. That's all I can say. The actual project had a code name. I think it was called Bumblebee. We knocked this project out of the park. My goodness, we killed it. Like if it were 100 meters, we ran it in 9.45. Okay. And I remember going into the client meeting and the partner pulled out this kind of, basically the client was just ecstatic, didn't have anything to say except we're just so happy about what happened and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the partner then opened a notebook and started trying to ask for feedback. The client didn't really have anything to say, but the partner kept on almost pressing for, oh, but how could we have improved? A bit like the way that people used to talk to Usain Bolt and say, oh, Usain, if you didn't eat chicken nuggets, could you have run it not in 9.58? You could have run it in 9.43. Let's talk about your diet. And it was really funny because the client was kind of confused because they were just so happy with what we'd done. They just wanted to use us across other clients. But anyway, the partner left the conversation with kind of an empty notebook, except for maybe a couple of things like, I don't know, you could have, I don't know, given just like fillers.
Yeah. Something. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And afterwards, I sat down and I just said, well, I actually use this analogy. I just said, I feel like we've just run 100 meters in world record breaking time. Is this a time where we need feedback, or is this a time where we just kind of look for the next opportunity and roll onto it? I don't know. Now, people can have different opinions on this. Some people might say, well, actually, Matano, you should always seek feedback and everything. But it was like we weren't comfortable just sitting with positivity and then just moving to the next thing. It was like we were just trying to eke out something different.
Yeah.
Culturally, I think it sometimes speaks to the fact that we're not comfortable with positive feedback, whether it's giving it to people, sitting with it, marinating in it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
on
I
that?
think that it goes back to the point I was making earlier on one hand, which is we're addicted to opinions. This kind of desire to constantly say, well, what did you think about that? This kind of constant navel gazing on something, you know, I just don't think it's always valuable. And I think part of it is knowing when it's useful, when it's not useful, because in that context, you delivered something really well. And maybe there's a different framing of it. Maybe the framing is, hey, look, what did we do well that you think we should continue to do? Because there's still feedback, but actually you want to kind of extricate from that the thing that you should keep doing. So I just think that, yeah, I think we're in a world where opinions are like noses. My boss used to say, everyone's got one. Everyone's got a nose. Everyone's got an opinion. And it's like, Okay. But you,
But I had an
yeah.
interesting example recently where I was managing someone, and when it came to giving them like probation review feedback, I just had nothing bad to say.
Well, yeah. And you don't want to
Like
drum
I just,
something up and be like, yeah,
but everybody starts like fishing around, like, oh,
yeah,
we need to
yeah.
find something. Like, I don't know, we don't like your hair.
But again, this is again, it's part of this kind of system and this spirit um of I don't know whether it's kind of validation, whether it's a kind of we need certainty or we're trying to get data points. Like, I think if the people that we laud, the people that we praise and the Steve Jobs of this world, some of these people were so focused on their task at hand. They were so focused on that task that they probably, I mean, I didn't know Stephen. Clearly, I didn't know him at all in any way, shape, or form, but he strikes me as someone who didn't have a lot of tolerance for the kind of willy-nilly feedback that people want to sort of, and so I guess part of what I'm saying is like, yes, let's be clear. On one hand, we all want to know where we can improve, and we all should be interested in that, particularly from people who are informed, who have the context, and who we trust, right? All day, every day. The fact that there are people out there in this world who go through their life without anyone ever being honest with them, for me, like that's a travesty. That you could be, there are people who are 40, 50, and no one has ever turned around to tell them about themselves or to tell them something really honest. And so they just continue to do the things. Like I know someone in particular who doesn't realize he talks a lot, for example. It's not you. I'd give you the feedback.
I'm
But
not ready. I'm not ready
you're
for
not
this.
ready. You're not ready for it. But me and Bianca were going back and forth about should I share this with him, because I'm the kind of person who will share something quite honest. And we got to we made a decision around what made sense, and it just we didn't think he was ready for it. But like this person's an older guy, and I suspect I don't know how many people have ever been that honest. But I did want to, as we get ready to land the plane, you had mentioned something we talked about before about relational debt, and it's something that stayed in my head. And I'm wondering if we can apply it to like family life and friendships, that most people can relate to that. Because I think about my marriage, I think about my relationship with my children. And as far as I understand relational debt, we talk about technical debt, and engineers have this code that they don't debug, or code that kind of over time just doesn't get looked at. And I was thinking, and maybe in a moment you can explain really, because I'm not probably doing a good job of it, but in relationships, we bump up against each other in different ways. And it can be hard to be honest about that, because often we don't even know how we truly feel about it. So I can have some feelings about my daughters or Bianca, but I don't really know how I feel about it, or I can't even articulate it. And so that debt builds up and builds up and builds up until the point where you need someone, a mediator or someone who can help sort of sit down
Yeah.
with you, So maybe you can talk about that.
I mean, first of all, shout out to it's a friend, Bianca, who runs a company called Elevate 4. I'm going to butcher her surname. I think it's Independent or Independente.
Okay.
I don't know. Sorry, Bianca. But yeah, she runs a company called Elevate 4 that looks at relational debt. So how do you stop relational debt from building up in a business because of the impacts it can have on team performance, culture? I just think it's a really powerful concept. It's a really powerful concept. But I know that talking to her, she often talks about one of the challenges, to your point around what do you feel, is that how do you even position yourself and understand emotionally where you're at, where your team is at day to day? Because sometimes there is a simmering cauldron of different feelings that bubble underneath the surface of companies and teams that impacts their ability to perform, impacts their ability to focus on the real task. But partly what she talks about is you have to first name and grow a sense of awareness of what those things are to then be able to deal with them. So she's got a piece of tech that teams use to kind of surface those kind of things bubbling away under the surface, and then almost like experiments or tasks that you start to take and do to change those things. But I think it's a really powerful concept, because the idea of debt, I remember in times in my life when I've carried debt, it weighs over you. The bigger the debt grows, the more you don't even want to read the letters coming through the post.
Yeah.
You just put them straight, you divert them straight into the bin. And then it grows and grows and grows until eventually the debt starts to poke through and starts to impact you and affect you. But what I love about feedback is there's this notion that could there be a way that we continually kind of pay off what we owe to each other? And then we
Yeah.
don't kind of walk around with this accumulating debt that all of us have and that burdens us and drags us down. And when I think about the worst bits or the hardest bits of corporate culture specifically, it's the kind of like the debt between you and a person where you've been up at night time because you don't want to have to go into that meeting, or there's been a particular vibe or a particular jab or dig that someone's made and you're not quite sure what's going on and why they're doing it. And this is the stuff that keeps people up at night. This is the stuff that makes people stress. This is the stuff that drives burnout, is this kind of this simmering cauldron of indebtedness that we refuse to kind of lean into and honestly and caringly share with each other.
You know, I think that's beautifully put, Mac. I love the way you've articulated that. And, you know, there was some research where some researchers went into a college area or a campus, and they put like chocolate marks and lipstick marks on their face, and they were researching, testing to see if people would give them feedback and say, hey, there's something on your face. I can't remember the stats, but it was like a very small percentage of people, very, very small, like less than 10%, spoke up. So basically, no one said, you've got lipstick on in the middle of your head. What's up with that? And I say that to say, because when we ask that question, like, why don't we have the honest conversations that will mean we don't rack up all of that relational debt? I think part of it is to do with, well, one, I've always said the word feedback itself isn't helpful, because it sounds like we've kind
I
of,
think perspectives, I love perspectives, to be honest with you.
there's perspectives. I really like perspectives.
Have you got
But
your
also,
own word?
Well, you know, I think it's like, I'll come to that, but by way of saying, we've extricated things from its context and we've set them in their own kind of world. So we've made feedback a separate thing. But what we're saying here, relational debt, the idea of owing someone something, like we're talking about relationships. As soon as we talk about feedback, we then reference a thing or a process or something that feels extricated from its original context. In a healthy, productive relationship, people are honest with each other. Like if you start there, in a healthy, productive relationship, people ought to be honest with each other. If we like,
And to build on that and to use that phrase of, you owe it to that person to give them feedback. Like you are depriving them of something
yeah,
by not giving them feedback.
depriving them of learning, right? And
When you look at infants, when infants come into the world, they have no idea what they feel. No idea. So if you think of an infant with its, I say an infant with its mother as an example, and it's crying, the mother will name the emotion that the infant has, that essentially from their perspective give feedback to that emotion. So the baby wails, again, common scenes. The mother or father might say, are you distressed? And will try and offer different perspectives. And eventually the child learns that that cry is distress. The child, if left, would never even know what their emotions felt like if they didn't have those perspectives constantly being fed back and tested with them. And sometimes, you know what it's like as a parent, sometimes you give feedback to an infant and you just got it completely wrong, but you're constantly what's wrong with them? Is it
that maternal reverie, right?
Yeah, is it your nappy? No, it's not. Are you cold? It's not. Oh, is it this? Oh, actually, you're a bit understimulated and actually need this. And you're constantly trying to name and give context to their emotion. And that's how they start to build a rich emotional world. The saddest thing is, when I work with people in therapy, for example, who never had parental feedback, they never had a parent who again had that reverie and that sort of preoccupation with trying to provide perspectives and help them name and sort of articulate and give shape to what they felt. But when you find people like that, there is a complete vacuum that they have within their psyches, their souls, because there was a complete absence of feedback in the earliest bit of their life. And then they're just left there trying to figure out what this gloop of emotion is that they're experiencing. And they're there as an adult trying to figure out, why do I have this gloop of emotion in my life? And I think the fact is, the work context, we spend most of our waking hours are in that context. Think about the opportunity that the workplace could be as a platform for growing into our best selves if we can truly create safe environments where people can share and provide perspectives. We can truly help people to become the best versions of ourselves. So I think I've always loved that kind of opportunity for work to shape who I truly am if I can find the right culture where feedback or perspectives happen.
Yeah. Well said, Mac. I think that's a great place to land and ties back to the examples we both shared earlier
Mm,
of, and what I hope people will take away, because this is a topic we could talk about for hours.
yeah.
But what I hope people will take away is, like, done well, an honest conversation is like medicine for the soul. You feel really good when you feel supported, when you feel like the person cares. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes in the moment it's hard to take, but maybe it takes a few weeks, maybe it takes a few months before you feel that. A friend of mine, Rohan, I'm going to give him a shout out. He listens to this podcast and he said to me, Kenny, my only criticism, in the spirit of feedback, you guys don't talk for long enough. It's too short. And it was fascinating feedback, because he said, Kenny, remember, I listened to it on 2 times speed. So when you think it's long, actually it's only half an hour rather than 1 hour. Another great example of useful feedback. So we just need to double the length of,
Yeah.
actually, before,
Or we can weigh the feedback and reject it.
or we can weigh the feedback and reject it and get some more data points. So give us some more feedback if you're listening. Mac, as always,
Great to chat.
great to chat. This is the half that's not been told on all things feedback. Thanks everyone for listening. Have a great rest of the week, whatever you're doing.